One day, every man wakes up with the same painful realization, but the few men who learn these lessons early become completely unshakable.
There comes a quiet moment in a man's life that no one prepares him for. Not the moment when he achieves something great, not the moment when he loses something painful, but the moment when he suddenly understands that most of the battles he fought were never real battles at all. He remembers the nights he stayed awake worrying about what people thought of him, the years he spent chasing approval from people who barely remembered his name, the anger he carried over small insults, the restless hunger to prove himself. And in that silent moment a strange realization settles into his chest. None of it mattered. The noise, the pride, the comparisons, the endless pursuit of validation. They were shadows on a wall, and he had spent half his life fighting them. The tragedy is not that life is difficult. The tragedy is that most men only learn this truth when half their life is already behind them. But if you are listening carefully, if something inside you feels strangely still as these words unfold, then perhaps you will learn these truths earlier. And if you learn them early enough, you may become something rare in this world, a man who cannot be shaken. Years ago I met a man who understood this better than anyone I had ever known. His name was Elias. At first glance there was nothing extraordinary about him. He was not rich. He was not famous. He did not speak loudly, and he never tried to impress anyone. In fact, most people overlooked him entirely, but there was something unusual about the way he moved through life. He carried a quiet gravity with him, a stillness, the kind of stillness you only see in ancient mountains or in deep water far below the surface where storms cannot reach. I first noticed him in a small public park where I used to go during a restless period of my life. At the time I was like many young men, ambitious, restless, easily offended, always searching for recognition. I believed success meant being admired. I believed strength meant winning arguments. I believed happiness would come once the world finally noticed my worth. So every evening I walked through that park with a mind full of noise. One evening I saw Elias sitting alone on a bench beneath an old oak tree. He sat there every day, always calm, always silent. Sometimes he read a small, worn notebook. Sometimes he simply watched the sky as if the passing clouds carried answers the rest of us could not see. For weeks, I passed by him without speaking. But I noticed something strange. People occasionally approached him. A young man once sat beside him for nearly an hour, speaking rapidly with visible frustration. Elias barely spoke during the entire conversation. Yet when the young man stood up to leave, his shoulders seemed lighter. Another time, an older man sat with him and spoke quietly. When he left, tears were in his eyes, but his face carried peace. It puzzled me. How could someone who spoke so little leave such a strong impression? Curiosity is a powerful force when a mind is young. One evening I finally approached him. He looked up as I stood there awkwardly. His eyes were calm, attentive, and strangely kind. Sit, he said gently, gesturing to the bench beside him. I sat down. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence felt unfamiliar. Most people rush to fill silence with words, but Elias seemed perfectly comfortable inside it. Finally I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind for weeks. Why do people come to talk to you? He looked at me for a moment, studying my face as if he were reading something deeper than my words. Then he said something I did not understand at the time. They do not come to talk, he said. They come because the world has made them tired. I frowned slightly. Tired of what? He looked toward the horizon where the sun was slowly setting. Tired of fighting the wrong battles. At the time the sentence seemed vague, almost poetic. But I nodded as if I understood. Youth often, pretends to understand wisdom it has not yet earned. For a few minutes we sat quietly again. Then he asked me a question. Tell me, he said calmly, what are you chasing? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? He smiled slightly. All young men are chasing something. Recognition, wealth, victory, respect. He paused. Which one is yours? I thought about it. I want to succeed, I said confidently. And what is success? The question irritated me slightly. Achieving something. Great. He nodded slowly. And once you achieve it, what happens next? I hesitated. I'll achieve something even greater. He studied me for a moment. Then he said something that stayed with me for years. A man who does not understand enough will spend his life climbing ladders that are leaning against the wrong walls. The sentence bothered me. It felt like a challenge to everything I believed. What wall should the ladder be against then? I asked. Elias closed his notebook and placed it. Beside him, the wall of your own character. He said it simply as if it were obvious. I remember laughing quietly. It sounded noble, but also impractical. The world I knew rewarded ambition, competition, visibility, not quiet character. He noticed my reaction but did not criticize it. Instead, he asked another question. Tell me, he said, how much of your day is spent controlling your own mind? I opened my mouth to answer, but then paused. I had never thought about it. He continued. How? You. Much of your anger is chosen by you. How much of your stress is created by you? How much of your frustration is the result of other people controlling your emotions? His voice was calm, not accusatory, but something about those questions made me uncomfortable, because deep down I knew the answer. Most of my emotions were reactions. Reactions to criticism, reactions to comparison, reactions to other people's opinions. Elias leaned back slightly on the bench. Most men spend their lives, you believing they are powerful, he said, but they are controlled by everything around them. A stranger's comment can ruin their day. A small failure can destroy their confidence. A moment of rejection can haunt them for years. He looked at me again. Tell me, is that power? I stayed silent. He continued softly. Real strength begins the moment a man stops asking the world how he should feel. The wind moved gently through the oak tree above us. Leaves rustled quietly. For the first time, that evening I felt something strange. Not disagreement, not acceptance either, but the beginning of a question. A question that would take years to answer. And that question was simple. What if the strongest man in the world is the one who no longer needs the world to approve of him? At that moment, the sun had almost disappeared below the horizon. The sky was painted in deep orange and fading gold. Elias picked up his small notebook again. Young men chase noise, he said quietly. Older men, search for silence. Then he stood up slowly. Come back tomorrow if you wish, he said before walking away. I sat there alone under the oak tree, and for the first time in a long while, my mind was quiet, but I did not yet realize something important. That evening was not the end of a conversation. It was the beginning of a transformation that would unfold slowly, painfully, and inevitably, because the truths that shape a man's life are rarely learned quickly. They are learned through time, through mistakes, through the slow breaking of illusions. And Elias had only begun to show me the first one, the truth that most men discover far too late, that the world cannot shake a man who has learned to govern his own mind. But learning that truth would take far more than one conversation. And the next lesson Elias would give me would challenge something even deeper inside me. My need to be seen, my need to be admired, my need to matter in the eyes of others. At the time, I believed those desires were strength. I did not yet understand that they were chains. And chains, no matter how polished, are still chains. The next evening I returned to the park earlier than usual, not because Elias had told me to come early. He had given no instructions at all. But something about the quiet weight of his words the day before had lingered in my mind longer than I expected. Most conversations fade quickly. They dissolve into the noise of daily life. But some words settle deeper. They do not disappear. They sit quietly inside the mind, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples that continue long after the moment has passed. That was what had happened to me. All night I had replayed the conversation. A man who does not understand enough will spend his life climbing ladders that are leaning against the wrong walls. At the time I thought I understood ambition. I thought I understood success. I believed that recognition from the world was proof of value, but something about Elias's calm certainty made my confidence feel fragile. When I arrived at the park, the bench beneath the oak tree was empty. For a moment I wondered if he would come at all. Then, several minutes later, I saw him walking slowly along the gravel path. His pace was unhurried, the same quiet composure in his movement as always. He carried the same small notebook in his hand. When he reached the bench, he nodded once. You returned. It was not a question. I sat beside him. I thought about what you said yesterday, I admitted. He waited. He had a way of listening that made silence feel natural instead of awkward. I still don't understand something, I said. What is it? If success isn't what we chase, then what should a man chase? Elias looked ahead at the park for a moment before answering. Children were playing in the distance. A dog barked somewhere beyond the trees. The city murmured faintly beyond the park walls. The problem, he said calmly, is not that men chase things. The problem is that they chase the wrong things first. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? He rested his hands on his knees. Tell me, he said, when a man is young, what does he usually want most? I answered without hesitation. Respect. He nodded. And how does he try to earn it? I thought about it. By achieving things. By proving himself. Elias gave a small smile. Yes. Then his expression became thoughtful. But here is the truth most men do not understand until much later. Respect that is given by others can also be taken by others. He let that sentence rest in the air. A reputation built in the eyes of the crowd is like writing your name in sand, he continued. The wind changes, and the name disappears. I felt a quiet resistance rising in my chest. But reputation still matters, I said. People judge you by it. They do, Elias replied. But tell me something. He turned slightly toward me. If 10 strangers admire you today, but tomorrow they turn, angst you, have you changed? The question caught me off guard. No. Then why, he asked calmly, would you allow their opinion to determine your worth? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came, because deep down I knew the truth. I already allowed that to happen. If someone praised me, I felt confident. If someone criticized me, my entire mood could collapse. Elias noticed the shift in my expression. You see, he said gently, most men build their emotional lives on unstable foundations. They allow the world to decide when they feel proud, when they feel ashamed, when they feel successful, when they feel like failures. He picked up a small stone from the ground and turned it slowly in his fingers. This stone does not care who praises it or insults it. It simply remains what it is. Then he placed the stone back down. A man must learn the same stability. I stared ahead quietly. The idea sounded simple, but when I examined my own life honestly, it felt almost impossible. Because so much of my motivation came from external recognition. Praise from others fueled my ambition. Criticism from others wounded my pride. If I removed those things, what would be left? Perhaps Elias sensed the conflict in my thoughts. Do not misunderstand, he said calmly. A man should still work hard. He should still build things. He should still contribute to the world. But if his identity depends on the applause of others, he will never know peace. He looked toward the horizon again. The crowd is restless. They praise today and condemn tomorrow. They admire strength until it threatens them. They celebrate success until envy appears. He paused. If you tie your sense of self to their voices, your life will feel like standing in the middle of a storm. The wind moved through the oak branches again. And for the first time I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent years trying to be admired. Years trying to appear impressive. Years trying to shape other people's perception of me. But I had spent almost no time shaping the one thing Elias kept talking about. My character. Elias opened his notebook slowly. Inside were short handwritten lines. Simple observations. Not long paragraphs. Just quiet thoughts. What is that? I asked. My reminders, he said. Reminders of what? Of how easily the mind forgets what matters. He turned a page and read quietly. A man who depends on praise becomes a servant to the crowd. He closed the notebook. You see, he said, the first Stoic truth most men learn too late is this. The world is not responsible for your peace. The words landed heavier than I expected, because they were both simple and deeply confronting. If the world was not responsible for my peace, then I was. And that meant every moment of anger, insecurity, jealousy, or wounded pride in my life could no longer be blamed on others. Responsibility returned to me. And responsibility is not always comfortable. Elias seemed to understand the weight of that realization. When a man is young, he said quietly, he believes the world must change in order for him to feel better. He wants people to treat him better. He wants life to become easier. He wants recognition to arrive sooner. Then Elias shook his head slightly. But wisdom reverses the direction of that expectation. A wise man does not ask the world to change. He trains his mind so that the world cannot disturb it. We sat quietly for several minutes. The evening sunlight had begun to soften again. The park slowly filled with the golden calm of late afternoon. I realized something important then. Elias was not teaching me clever ideas. He was teaching me responsibility. Responsibility for my thoughts. Responsibility for my reactions. Responsibility for the stability of my own inner world. And that kind of responsibility cannot be forced on someone. It must be chosen. After a long silence, I finally spoke again. So what should a man do? Focus on instead of reputation. Elias answered without hesitation. Control. The word felt heavier than the others. What kind of control? The only kind that truly exists, he said. Control over your thoughts, your responses, your actions. He looked at me again. You cannot control what people say about you. You cannot control how quickly success arrives. You cannot control how others behave. But you can control how you interpret events. You can control how you respond, and you can control the standards you hold for yourself. He leaned back slightly. When a man masters those things, something interesting happens. What? The world loses its power to disturb him. At that moment something shifted inside me, not a full understanding, but the beginning of one. For the first time I started to see that strength might not look the way I had always imagined. Strength might not be loud, it might not be aggressive, it might not even be visible. Real strength might be invisible. It might live quietly inside a disciplined mind. And if that was true, then Elias might be one of the strongest men I had ever met. But the truth he would reveal next would challenge me even more deeply, because the next illusion most men carry is far more difficult to release. The illusion that they have unlimited time. And that lesson would arrive sooner than I expected. A few days passed before I saw Elias again, not because he had disappeared, but because life had briefly pulled my attention back into its usual rhythm. Work demanded focus, conversations filled my days, and the noise of ordinary responsibilities returned like a familiar tide. Yet something inside me had changed. The questions Elias had planted in my mind had not disappeared. In fact, they had grown stronger. During meetings, I noticed how often people fought quietly for recognition. During casual conversations, I saw how quickly small criticisms could wound someone's pride. Even within myself, I began to observe how easily my mood shifted depending on what others said or thought. It was as if Elias had given me a new pair of eyes, and once a man begins to see clearly, he cannot easily return to blindness. When I returned to the park that week, the air carried the cool calm of early evening. The sky had a pale silver color that comes just before sunset. Elias was already sitting beneath the oak tree. He was writing in his small notebook. As I approached, he looked up with the same quiet, attentiveness. You have been thinking, he said. It wasn't a guess. I sat beside him. Yes, I admitted. Too much, maybe. He smiled faintly. Thinking rarely harms a man. Only thinking without discipline harms him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question I did not expect. How old are you? 26. He nodded slowly. When I was 26, he said, I believed life was long. He closed the notebook. Most young men do. I waited. Something in his tone suggested, that another lesson was coming. Tell me, he continued calmly, how many years do you believe you have ahead of you? The question felt strange. I don't know, 40, 50? Elias looked at me carefully. You assume that time belongs to you. I hesitated. Well, doesn't it? He leaned back slightly against the bench. No, he said gently. Time does not belong to anyone. The wind moved quietly through the trees again. He continued. The second truth men learn too late is this. They live as if time is endless. They postpone what matters. They delay becoming disciplined. They tell themselves they will become wiser later. He paused, but later arrives faster than they expect. His words carried a quiet gravity. I thought about my own habits, how often I postponed difficult things, how often I told myself I would become more disciplined soon. Soon I will wake earlier. Soon I will become more focused. Soon I will stop wasting time. Soon. The words sounded harmless, but Elias seemed to see something dangerous hidden inside it. When men are young, he said calmly, they believe they are preparing for life. They think the real life will begin later. He looked toward the path where people walked slowly through the park. But life is not waiting for them. It is happening while they prepare. His voice remained soft, but the meaning struck with quiet force. How many years, he asked, have you already spent distracted? I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't like the answer. Elias continued. Most men do not waste their lives through catastrophe. They waste it through comfort, through distraction, through small delays repeated thousands of times, through the quiet belief that tomorrow will always be available. He reached down and picked up a dry leaf from the ground. The leaf crumbled slightly in his hand. Look at this, he said. This leaf once believed it had the entire season ahead of it. He opened his fingers, letting the brittle pieces fall. But seasons move quickly. For a long moment I watched the fragments drift down to the ground. A strange feeling crept into my mind, not fear, but awareness. Until that moment, time had always felt like something distant and generous. Now it felt limited, precious. Elias spoke again. The Stoics understood something many people avoid thinking about. What's that? I asked. That death is not an enemy. The statement surprised me. How could it not be? He shook his head. You. Slightly. Death gives life its urgency. If time were endless, nothing would matter. No action would be important. No moment would carry meaning. He looked at me again. It is the limit of time that forces a man to choose carefully how he lives. I felt a quiet shift inside my thinking. Until now, I had avoided thoughts about time running out. Like most people, I treated it as a distant concern. But Elias spoke about it as if it were a compass, something that guided wise decisions. A man understands that time is limited, he said. His priorities begin to change. Petty arguments lose their appeal. Seeking approval becomes exhausting. Wasting hours on meaningless distraction feels painful. He leaned forward slightly, because he begins to see something clearly. What? That every day spent poorly is a day that cannot be reclaimed. The simplicity of the statement made it powerful. I suddenly remembered how many evenings I had spent scrolling through meaningless distractions, telling myself I was relaxing. How many mornings I had delayed important work because I felt unmotivated. How many conversations I had filled with complaints instead of growth. Elias seemed to read the realization in my expression. Do not feel regret, he said calmly. Regret is useful only if it leads to change. Otherwise, it is just another form of wasted energy. That sentence felt strangely freeing. Instead of feeling guilty about lost time, I felt something else. Responsibility again. Responsibility for how I would use the time that remained. Elias continued quietly. A disciplined man treats time as his most valuable possession. Not money. Status. Not reputation. He tapped his notebook lightly. Time. Because time is the only currency that cannot be earned again once it is spent. We sat silently for a while. The sun had begun to lower behind the trees. Shadows stretched across the grass. After a moment I asked a question that had been growing in my mind. If time is so valuable, why do most people waste it? Elias answered almost immediately. Because they believe they will become serious later. He smiled faintly. Later is the most dangerous word in the human vocabulary. That sentence lingered in the air between us. Later. Later I will become disciplined. Later I will take life seriously. Later I will stop living carelessly. But later has a strange habit of never arriving. Elias stood slowly from the bench. The evening air, had cooled slightly. Tell me something, he said as he looked down the path. If a man knew he had only 10 years left to live, how differently would he act? The question struck deeply. He continued. He would stop arguing about meaningless things. He would stop waiting for permission to improve. He would stop chasing approval from people who do not matter. He turned back toward me. He would begin living deliberately. Then Elias said something that would stay with me forever. The Stoic, does not wait for death to remind him that time is precious. He remembers it every day. The park had grown quieter now. Most of the visitors had left. The fading sunlight painted the sky in soft gold again. I realized something slowly. The first lesson Elias had given me was about control. The second was about time. Control over the mind, respect for time. Two pillars of strength that most men ignore until life forces them to learn. But Elias had one more truth waiting. A truth even more difficult for men to accept, because it required confronting something deeply uncomfortable, the idea that suffering, difficulty, and pressure are not obstacles in life. They are the very things that shape a man's character. And without them, a man never becomes strong. I did not yet understand that lesson, but soon Elias would show me. And when he did, everything I believed about hardship would begin to change. The following week, something unexpected happened. I arrived at the park earlier. Usual, the quiet gravel path still mostly empty. The evening sun hung gently above the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. But Elias was not on the bench beneath the oak tree. For the first time since our conversations began, the bench was empty. At first I thought perhaps I had simply arrived too early, so I sat down and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The silence of the park felt different that day. Not uncomfortable but reflective, the kind of silence that forces a man to sit with his own thoughts instead of escaping them. I realized that during the past weeks my evenings had begun to change. Instead of rushing through the day chasing small urgencies, I had started noticing things, how people reacted to pressure, how quickly irritation appeared in conversations, how often people complained about difficulties, and most importantly, how I reacted to those same things. Before meeting Elias, hardship had always felt like an interruption, a problem, an inconvenience, something to be avoided. But the questions he had planted in my mind had started to challenge that belief. Just as I began to wonder if Elias would come at all, I noticed him walking slowly toward the bench. His pace was slightly slower than usual, but his posture remained calm and steady. When he reached the bench, he sat down beside me without speaking. For a moment we simply watched the quiet movement of the park. Finally he spoke. "Tell me," he said calmly, "how has your week been?" I thought about it. "Busy," I said, "and a little frustrating." "What happened?" "A few things at work went wrong," I admitted. "Plans changed. People made mistakes. It slowed everything down." Elias nodded. "And how did you respond?" I hesitated. "Honestly, I felt irritated, of course," he said gently. "Most people do." He looked toward the distant line of trees. "Difficulties have a way of revealing the true condition of a man's mind." I leaned back slightly on the bench. "What do you mean?" "When life is easy," he said, "almost anyone can appear calm. Almost anyone can appear disciplined. Almost anyone can appear wise." He paused. "But ease is not the environment that reveals character." His voice remained calm. "Pressure does." The words carried a quiet weight. He continued, "The third truth men learn too late is that hardship is not an enemy." I frowned slightly. "That's hard to believe when you're in the middle of it." Elias smiled faintly. "Yes, because most men, misunderstand the purpose of difficulty." He reached down and picked up a small branch that had fallen from the oak tree. Holding it gently, he bent it slightly between his fingers. "Tell me," he said, "how does this branch become strong?" I thought for a moment. "I don't know." "It grows through resistance," he said, "through wind, through storms, through the weight of seasons." He released the branch. "If this tree had grown in a perfectly protected environment, with no wind, no resistance, no pressure," he gestured upward toward the massive oak tree, "it would collapse under its own weight." I looked up at the thick branches spreading across the sky. The idea was simple but powerful. Elias continued, "The same is true for men. Without difficulty, without responsibility, without pressure, a man never develops strength." His voice remained steady. "Comfort produces fragile minds." That sentence stayed with me, because when I examined my own frustrations that week, I realized something. Most of them came from discomfort, plans changing, unexpected obstacles, situations that demanded patience, and my mind had reacted by resisting those difficulties. "But what if resistance itself was the problem?" Elias continued. "Most men spend their lives trying to eliminate hardship. They want life to become easier. They want obstacles to disappear. They want pressure to fade." He shook his head slowly. "But if that happened, they would remain weak." He turned toward me. Slightly. "Strength is built the same way muscle is built. Through resistance. Through strain. Through recovery and growth." I thought about the gym, the way muscles grow only when pushed beyond comfort. Yet when it came to life, I had expected comfort to produce strength. The contradiction was obvious now. Elias noticed my quiet reflection. "Tell me," he said gently, "when was the last time you grew significantly as a person?" I thought carefully, and the answer surprised me. It had never happened during easy periods. Growth had always followed difficulty. Moments when I was forced to adapt, moments when I was forced to learn, moments when pressure demanded maturity. Elias nodded slowly when I shared that thought. "Exactly. Hardship is not punishment. It is instruction." The wind moved softly through the leaves above us. "Life trains those who are willing to be trained," he continued, "but most people resist the training. They complain about the weight instead of lifting. Yet, they blame the obstacle instead of learning from it." He leaned forward slightly. "The Stoic does something different." "What does he do?" I asked. "He welcomes the challenge, not because he enjoys suffering, not because he seeks difficulty, but because he understands its purpose." Elias picked up his notebook again and opened it. He read a short line. "Fire tests gold." Then he closed the notebook. "And difficulty tests men." I sat quietly with that thought. For years I had viewed problems as interruptions to my plans. Something unfair, something unfortunate. But Elias was suggesting something radically different, that obstacles were not interruptions. They were part of the process. He spoke again. Imagine two men walking through life. One avoids every challenge, the other faces them. Which one becomes stronger? The second, I said. Of course. Yet most men still choose the first path. He smiled slightly. Because strength is built slowly, while comfort feels you good immediately. The sky had begun to deepen into evening colors again. The park had grown quieter. And as I sat there listening, another realization began forming in my mind. If time was limited, and if hardship was necessary, then avoiding difficulty was actually wasting time, because every avoided challenge delayed growth. Elias seemed to notice the shift in my thinking. Now you begin to see, he said softly. The Stoic does not ask life to remove obstacles. He asks for the strength to use them. His voice carried calm conviction. Every obstacle contains a hidden gift. Patience, discipline, resilience, wisdom, but only if a man chooses to extract it. For a long moment we sat in silence again. The lesson had settled deeply. Hardship was not something to resent, it was something to use. But Elias had one final truth to reveal, a truth that many men struggle with even more than hardship, because it requires letting go of something the ego desperately wants to keep, the need to control everything, the need to control outcomes, the need to control the future. And the final lesson of becoming unshakable would require something very rare, the courage to accept what cannot be controlled without losing inner peace. That lesson would change everything. The final lesson arrived on an evening that felt quieter than all the others. The sky above the park was pale and clear, the kind of sky that makes the world seem slower, almost thoughtful. A soft breeze moved, through the oak tree above the bench where Elias and I had spoken so many times. By then our conversations had begun to feel less like meetings and more like a continuation of a single, unfolding reflection. Weeks earlier, I had come to the park with a restless mind, full of ambition and noise. Now I arrived with something different. Curiosity, yes, but also patience. Elias was already there, sitting with the same small notebook resting in his hands. He looked up as I approached and nodded, as he always did. Sit. I sat beside him. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us had become natural over time. It was no longer something that needed to be filled. Finally, Elias closed his notebook and looked toward the horizon. You have been listening carefully, he said. I've been trying to. He gave a small smile. Trying is enough. The park was quiet that evening. The usual sounds of conversation and footsteps seemed distant. Then Elias asked a question that felt different from the others. Tell me, he said calmly, what is the one thing that causes most of your stress? I thought about it. Work pressure, uncertainty, future plans. But when I looked deeper, the answer became clearer. Things not going the way I expect. Elias nodded slowly. Yes, he folded his hands together. The final truth men learn too late is this. Life does not obey your plans. I let out a quiet breath. That's true, but most men resist this truth, he continued. They believe that if they plan carefully enough, if they work hard enough, if they control every detail, life will behave exactly as they intend. He paused. But life is not a machine. It is movement. Change. Uncertainty. The wind moved gently through the oak branches. I had begun to see this already. Plans fail. People change. Opportunities appear and disappear. The future refuses to behave like a carefully designed map. Elias continued. Most suffering is created by one simple mistake. What? Mistake? I asked, trying to control what cannot be controlled. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them felt enormous. He looked toward the path where a few people walked slowly through the park. You cannot control how others think. You cannot control every outcome. You cannot control every outcome. You cannot control whether success arrives quickly or slowly. You cannot control the future. Then he turned slightly toward me. But you can control something far more important. What? How you respond. I remembered the very first lesson he had given me weeks ago. Control over the mind. Control over reactions. Control over character. Elias nodded as if he could see the connection forming. The Stoic does not waste energy fighting reality. He works with it. He leaned back slightly on the bench. When a storm comes, the wise sailor does not shout at the wind. He adjusts the sails. I smiled slightly. The metaphor was clear. Resisting reality only wastes energy. Adapting to it creates strength. Elias continued. When a man accepts that some things are beyond his control, something interesting happens. He becomes calm. Not passive, not weak, but calm. because his energy is no longer scattered across impossible battles. Instead, it becomes focused on action, focused on discipline, focused on the one territory he truly governs, his own mind. I sat quietly as the idea settled deeper. For years I had been frustrated by things outside my control, other people's decisions, unexpected delays, situations that refused to unfold the way I wanted. But Elias was showing me a different path, not control over life, control within life, and that difference changes everything. He looked at the horizon again. You see now why most men become wise only later in life, because it takes years of frustration to finally accept these truths. Control your mind. Respect your time. Cannot be controlled. He spoke the lessons slowly, as if placing them carefully into the air. These truths are simple, he said, but they are not easy, because the ego resists them. The sky had begun to glow softly as the sun prepared to disappear. The golden light filtered through the branches above us. For a moment, Elias remained silent. Then he asked one final question. What kind of man do you want to become? The question felt heavier than any before it, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I understood what the answer required. Discipline, responsibility, patience, a life built from the inside outward. I want to become someone who cannot be shaken, I said quietly. Elias studied me for a moment. Then he nodded. That is a worthy goal. He stood slowly from the bench. But remember something. Becoming unshakable does not happen through one realization, that it happens through daily practice. He looked down the path that led out of the park. Every day will give you opportunities to train your mind. A rude, comment. A failed plan, a moment of pressure. These are not interruptions, they are training. He looked back at me one last time. The man who understands this becomes rare, because while others react, he remains steady. While others complain, he adapts. While others chase approval, he builds character. He gave a quiet smile. And eventually, the world loses its ability to disturb him. The sun disappeared behind the horizon then, leaving the park in soft twilight. Elias picked up his notebook and began walking slowly down the gravel path. I watched him until he disappeared beyond the trees. That was the last evening I ever saw him in that park, but strangely, it did not feel like an ending. Because the real conversation had never been about Elias. It had been about something deeper, the quiet work of shaping a disciplined mind, the patient process of building character, the choice to live deliberately instead of drifting through life. And over time I realized, something important. The strongest men are not always the loudest. They are not always the most visible. Often they are simply the most stable. They govern their thoughts. They respect their time. They welcome difficulty. They accept reality. And through that quiet discipline, they become something powerful. A man who cannot be shaken. If this story spoke to something inside you, then take a moment to reflect on it. Because the Stoic path is not about perfection. It is about awareness. It is about choosing every day to strengthen the part of yourself that the world cannot control. And if you want to continue walking that path of inner discipline, quiet strength, and Stoic wisdom, then stay with us here on Built by Stoicism. Subscribe, not for entertainment, but for reflection, because the goal is not simply to listen to wisdom. The goal is to live it. And the journey toward becoming unshakable begins with the next decision you make today.